High in the Estelero Mountains of Zacatecas, Mexico, where the air runs thin and the nights fall well below freezing, there sits a cave that, by every rule we thought we knew, should not matter. It rests nearly 2,700 meters above the sea, a full 1,000 meters above the valley floor, its entrance sealed by collapse at the close of the last ice age. For most of a human lifetime, no one had reason to climb to it. Then someone dug, and buried beneath the cave floor, packed into sediment that had not been disturbed in tens of thousands of years, lay something that should not have been there at all. If it is what it appears to be, people were living here at a time when, according to every textbook, no human had yet set foot in the Americas. Not everyone agrees on what was found. The mountain does not make it easy. Two interconnected chambers stretch more than 50 meters wide and 15 meters high, the floor sloping downward into the dark, crusted over with stone formations that took tens of thousands of years to grow. Inside, the temperature holds steady at 12 degrees no matter the season. Beyond the entrance, there is no light at all. To reach the place where the digging happened, researchers must slip through a secondary opening and work their way 50 meters into the heart of the rock, where a single wrong move could bring the ceiling down. This is not a cave that invites visitors. It never was. The man who changed its reputation is an archaeologist named Ciprian Ardelean of the Autonomous University of Zacatecas. For the better part of a decade, he had combed the region for signs of early human settlement, checking site after site, roughly 35 in all, and finding nothing that held up. Then, in the year 2010, local villagers mentioned a remote cave high on a peak they called Chiquihuite. Ardelean did not expect much. He thought, by his own account, that he might find little more than an old animal den. What he found instead were two vast vaulted chambers descending steeply into the mountain, and a question that would occupy him for years. 2 years later, in 2012, he drilled a test pit into the cave floor. Out came stone. Not the shapeless rubble the mountain sheds on its own, but pieces that looked worked, shaped, chosen. And when the organic material packed around them was dated, the numbers stopped him cold. Some of that stone sat in layers reaching back around 26,000 years. The very oldest reached further still, toward 31, even 33,000 years. He checked, and the sediment had not been disturbed since the day it settled. To understand why those numbers landed like a hammer, you have to understand the story they threatened. For most of the 20th century, the arrival of humans in the Americas was treated as more or less settled. People crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia around 13,000 years ago, so the account went, when retreating glaciers finally opened a corridor south. The Clovis people, named for their distinctive tools, were the first Americans. Their handiwork turned up from Alaska to Mexico, and their story was written into classrooms, textbooks, and the pages of academic journals, defended for generations as the foundation of the whole field. Chiquihuite did not politely revise that timeline. If Ardelean's dates were right, it very nearly doubled it. It suggested that people were present in central Mexico not a few centuries before the Clovis culture, but 15,000 years before it existed. It placed human hands at work during the last glacial maximum itself, the coldest, harshest stretch of the Ice Age, when great sheets of ice smothered much of North America, and the land here would have punished anything trying to survive on it. And yet, if the cave was telling the truth, someone was up there, shaping stone, sheltering from the cold, coming and going across a span of time almost impossible to hold in the mind. That is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims are not accepted on the strength of how exciting they are. There were no hearths in that cave, no butchered animal bones, no clear floor where a family had lived. There was stone, and there were dates, and there was a mountain notorious for breaking rock all on its own. So before anyone could ask who these people were, or where they came from, or where they went, a harder question had to be answered first. Were they people at all? The fight over that began the moment the tools left the ground. Over 4 seasons of digging, the cave gave up close to 1,930 pieces of worked stone. Blades, points, scrapers. The small, sharp flakes that fall away when someone sits and shapes a tool with patience and intent. Laid out together, it was not a handful of ambiguous fragments, but an assemblage, a body of material large enough to argue over for years to come. And the argument began, oddly enough, not with the shapes of the stones, but with the stone itself. The tools were made from a green and blackish recrystallized limestone. That detail matters more than it first sounds, because that particular stone does not occur inside Chiquihuite. The cave is one composition, the tools are another, which means the raw material did not fall from the ceiling or wash in from the walls. Someone selected it somewhere else, and someone carried it up a mountain nearly 2,700 meters high, into a chamber deep in the dark, and worked it there. Stone does not climb. People carry it. Then there was the matter of where in the ground the pieces were found. More than 200 of them came from layers lying beneath the horizon that marks the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. According to the accepted account, that stretch of sediment should have been empty. No people, no tools, no trace of anyone at all, because no one was supposed to be here yet. Yet the artifacts sat there, locked in soil that had not been touched since it was laid down, quietly refusing to obey the timeline. The team did not rest the case on a single date either. They pulled more than 50 separate measurements from the cave, radiocarbon readings and optical dating both, and from them built a chronology of coming and going. It showed people using the site on and off from around 33,000 years ago until roughly 12,000 years ago, when the main entrance finally collapsed and sealed the place away. Read plainly, that is something like 21,000 years of intermittent human presence. 21,000 years of people returning to the same mountain cave, generation after generation, working the same kind of stone in the same patient way, long before the first Clovis point was ever struck. When Ardelean and his colleagues published all of this in the journal Nature in July of 2020, it landed as exactly the kind of bombshell it sounds like. Here was a peer-reviewed claim, backed by every modern technique the team could throw at the rock, that humans had reached the heart of Mexico tens of thousands of years earlier than the textbooks allowed. If it held, it did not adjust the story of the first Americans. It rewrote the opening chapter entirely. But an honest account has to say what the cave did not give up, and Chiquihuite withheld a great deal. There were no hearths in those chambers, no soot-black rings where fires had burned. There were no animal bones marked by butchering, no clear living surfaces worn smooth by daily use. And when the researchers searched the sediment for ancient human DNA, hoping to find some genetic fingerprint of whoever had left the tools behind, they found none. Not a trace. The stone was there in abundance, and the dates were there in number, but the people themselves had left almost nothing of their bodies or their habits behind. To Ardelean, that silence fit a group passing through, not settling in. To his critics, that same silence was the whole problem. Those missing hearths, those absent bones, that empty search for human DNA were not minor gaps to be waved away. They were the openings through which the skeptics would come, and they came hard. The first and simplest objection was also the hardest to shake. A cave is a machine for breaking stone. Water seeps into cracks, freezes, and splits the rock apart. Slabs peel from the ceiling and shatter on the floor. Sediment shifts under its own weight, and grinds one piece against another over thousands of years. All of that happens with no human hand involved at all, and some of what it produces looks unnervingly like a crude tool. A sharp edge, a struck-looking face, a flake that seems, at a glance, to have been driven off on purpose. Loren Davis, an archaeologist at Oregon State University who examined the Chiquihuite claims, put the problem bluntly. Human beings, he pointed out, do not hold a monopoly on the physics required to break a rock. Freeze and thaw will do it. Falling stone will do it. Pressure and time will do it. And if nature can manufacture something that resembles a tool without any person present, then the resemblance alone cannot prove that a person was there. You need more than a shape that looks right. You need context, and context was exactly what the cave was short of. Two other researchers pressed the point harder still. James Chatters, working with Ben Potter, laid out a detailed rebuttal in the journal Paleo America in 2021. Their argument turned on the setting. Chiquihuite sits in a high-energy environment, a cliff face where rock is constantly falling and tumbling. When stones crash and strike one another in that kind of place, Chatters explained, they drive shards off each other, and those shards often carry some of the very features we associate with rock broken by people. The limestone walls of the cave, in other words, could have been producing tool-shaped debris on their own, no toolmaker required. Then came the manufacturing problem. When people sit and make stone tools in the same place over a long span of time, they do not just leave the finished blades and points, they leave the wreckage of the process. Cores, the lumps of stone from which flakes are struck, the small secondary and tertiary flakes that fall away in the final stages of shaping an edge. That debris is the signature of sustained toolmaking, and by the critics' reading, that signature was not clearly present at Chiquihuite. You had objects that looked like tools, but not the workshop floor that should have surrounded them. And behind all of it stood the argument that troubled even sympathetic readers the most. Genetics. If a population had truly lived at this cave, on and off, for something like 20,000 years, they should have left a mark on the human family tree somewhere. Yet the search for human DNA inside the cave came back empty, and the genomes of living Native American peoples show no connection to any theoretical group that old. Whoever supposedly climbed that mountain for 200 centuries would have had to vanish so completely as to be genetically invisible, contributing not a single traceable gene to anyone who came after. That is a very large thing to ask of the evidence. Weighing all of it together, Chatters reached a plain conclusion. The likeliest explanation, he argued, was that the so-called tools were geofacts, shapes made by geology rather than by hands, and that any real human presence at the site, if it existed at all, was far younger than the headline dates suggested. It was a serious answer from serious people, and it could not simply be brushed aside. Ardelean, for his part, did not intend to brush it aside. He intended to answer it. And to do that, he went back down into the collection, picked up the stones one by one, and began looking for the things that geology, for all its power, is not supposed to be able to fake. His answer began with where. Ardelean took 10 of the artifacts and studied them in exhaustive detail, looking not at their overall shape, but at their working edges, the places where a tool meets the material it is used on. Nearly 30% of the pieces, he reported, carried marks along those edges, consistent with use, tiny patterns of damage that come from cutting and scraping rather than from a rock tumbling down a slope. Random fracture does not use a tool, it only breaks it. Where that clusters on an edge, in the way a hand would wear it, is a harder thing for geology to explain. Then he returned to the stone itself. Analysis of the material confirmed what the first excavations had suggested. The tools were made of a limestone whose composition did not match the walls of the cave. That green and blackish rock had come from somewhere else, which meant it had to be carried in, up the mountain, and into the dark. And many of the pieces, by their shape, appeared to have been flaked with hammers of wood or bone, the kind of soft implements that would have rotted away entirely across 30,000 years, leaving only their effect behind in the stone. There was also something distinctive in the tools that set them apart. Some were transversal points, wider than they were long, made with a small, deliberate technique unlike anything found at other Mexican sites. To Ardelean, this was not a scatter of accidental shapes. It was a tradition, a particular way of making things, learned and repeated, that existed at this cave and so far, nowhere else. A method that appeared, endured, and then disappeared without leaving descendants to carry it forward. To see whether the cave could have been livable at all, the team turned to the sediment for a different kind of evidence, and here the ground offered something the skeptics had not accounted for. Locked in the layers was ancient DNA and microscopic plant material from the world outside as it had been long ago. They found palm phytoliths, tiny silica structures shed by palm plants, deep inside a cave that today sits at nearly 2,700 meters in dry mountain terrain where no palm could survive. They found pollen from Douglas fir, a tree no longer native to this part of Mexico. The message was consistent. At the height of the Ice Age, this was not desert. It was cooler, wetter, greener, a landscape of mixed forest and grassland where dry slopes stand now, an almost different world. That reframed the cave. In a harsh and shifting country, a chamber that held a steady 12 degrees year-round, sheltered from storms, looking out over the valley roots below, would have been worth the climb. Eske Willerslev, the geneticist from Cambridge and Copenhagen whose team led the ancient DNA work, suggested the site had served not as a permanent home, but as a seasonal refuge, a winter shelter, or a base camp used during hunting migrations. People came for part of the year, stayed briefly, and left. Over thousands of years, those short, repeated visits would pile up tools without ever building the thick, greasy occupation layer of a settlement lived in day after day. And that, quietly, answered the skeptics' strongest ordinary objection. The missing hearths, the absent living surfaces, the thinness of it all, were exactly what you would expect from people passing through rather than settling down. It did not prove the case beyond dispute, and Ardelean did not claim it did. But it turned the silence in the cave from an embarrassment into something that fit. And if he was right, then Chiquihuite was no longer just one strange cave. It was a loose thread, and pulling it began to unravel the whole map of how the Americas were first peopled. The unraveling did not stay confined to one mountain. Alongside the cave study, a second paper appeared in Nature, this one led by Lorena Becerra Valdivia and Thomas Hyam of the University of Oxford. Rather than dig a new site, they gathered the dating from many old ones, 42 archaeological locations spread across North America and Beringia, the ancient land that once bridged Asia and Alaska. Then they ran all of it through a statistical method called Bayesian age modeling, a technique built to handle the uncertainty that always clings to radiocarbon dates, and asked what pattern the numbers made when you looked at them together. The pattern they drew was not the clean, single arrival everyone had grown up with. It suggested that people were present in North America before, during, and immediately after the last glacial maximum, not in great waves, but in small, scattered groups, leaving only faint traces on the land. According to their model, those early populations stayed thin and quiet for a very long time. The real surge came later, during a burst of rapid warming around 14,700 years ago, a climatic turning point that seems to have opened the door to population growth and to the later tool traditions, Clovis among them, that finally left a bold mark in the record. The implication underneath all of this was profound. It suggested the Americas were not colonized once in a single triumphant migration, but many times by different groups across tens of thousands of years. And most of those early arrivals, the model implied, simply failed. They came, they held on for centuries or millennia in isolated pockets, and then they were gone, contributing nothing lasting to the genetic or cultural record that followed. Chiquihuite in this reading was one such failure preserved by luck, a small band who found a mountain cave and then vanished from history. It was not the only site whispering the same thing. Bluefish caves in Canada's Yukon had yielded dates reaching back around 24,000 years. The Galt site in Texas showed signs of people before Clovis. Santa Helena in Brazil produced comparably ancient readings, and Cactus Hill in Virginia, along with Meadowcroft in the eastern United States, pointed toward a human presence earlier than the standard story allowed. No single one of these places settled the matter. Each faced its own challenges over dating and over whether its artifacts were truly made by human hands, but laid side by side, they began to look less like a string of isolated errors and more like a mosaic, many separate hints across a hemisphere all leaning in the same unlikely direction. Still, an honest account cannot tilt the scale here, because the weight on the other side is real. Critics, Chatters, and Potter among them, argued that this whole revised picture rested on sites too shaky to bear it, and that when you weigh the genetic evidence together with the soundly dated archaeology, a later arrival, sometime after 16,000 years ago, still fits the whole body of data best. The mosaic, in their view, was built from stones that would not hold. Ruth Groen, an emeritus professor at the University of Alberta, captured the difficulty plainly in a commentary for Nature. An entry date of 30,000 years ago, she noted, would be extraordinarily hard for most archaeologists to accept. It was roughly double the estimate the field had settled around, and taking it seriously meant giving up a great many comfortable assumptions about when people came, how they traveled, and how visible they should be in the ground. That is not a small thing to ask of a discipline. And yet, even setting aside the fierce dispute over dates, one question sat beneath all of it, untouched by any model, and it may be the strangest of all. Who were these people? They were not the Clovis people. Those arrived thousands of years later, and the whole point of Chiquihuite, if it holds, is that someone was there long before them. Nor do they appear to be the ancestors of today's Native American peoples, because the genetics do not connect. Whoever left those tools, by the time the familiar first Americans spread across the continent, had already been gone for a very long while. Ardelean called them a complete enigma, and he meant it without exaggeration. We do not know where they came from. We do not know where they went. He described them as lost groups, populations that entered this land, endured for a time, and then vanished so thoroughly that they left no descendants at all, only stone buried in a cave that no one would open for tens of thousands of years. David Meltzer, an archaeologist who reviewed the findings, pressed on the part that unsettled him most. Why this cave? Most sites do not show people returning again and again over such an enormous span of time, and when they do, it is usually because something valuable draws them back. Water, rich hunting, stone worth carrying home. Chiquihuite offered none of that in any obvious way. It was high, hard to reach, exposed to brutal weather, and poor in the very resources that normally anchor people to a place. Yet for something like 20,000 years, by the excavators' reading, they kept making the climb. No one can say for certain why. Perhaps the cave marked a boundary, the edge of one group's country. Perhaps it held some meaning we would now call ritual. Perhaps it was simply a known landmark passed down in memory and story. A place you stopped because those before you had stopped there. A fixed point on a map carried only in the mind. The excavation cannot answer it, and Ardelean does not pretend otherwise, because the part of the cave that might hold the answer is the part no one can reach. The richest deposits lie buried under the collapsed entrance, sealed away when the mountain came down some 12,000 years ago. What the team could dig was a fraction of the whole, deep in the secondary chambers, where far less of ordinary life would ever have taken place. so the site leaves us standing in an honest and uncomfortable place, with two explanations and no easy way to choose between them. If the stones are tools, then they are the only surviving trace of a people who lasted for millennia and then disappeared so completely that even their genes are gone from the world. If the stones are geofacts, then nature managed to counterfeit the work of human hands again and again across 20,000 years of layered sediment in a pattern convincing enough to fool trained specialists. Neither is comfortable. Both ask you to believe something that ought to be rare, and the evidence as it stands does not force the choice. It only sharpens it. That may be the most important thing Chiquihuite has given us, more than any single date on any single stone. It has taken a story that felt finished, the tidy account of when the first people reached this hemisphere and who they became, and shown that the edges of it are far softer than we let ourselves believe. Whether the cave is remembered one day as a revolution or as a cautionary tale, it has already done something that cannot be undone. It has made the confident version of the past sound a little less certain. And once a settled story starts to wobble, you begin to wonder what else, in all those layers we have not yet dug, is still waiting quietly underneath, holding its silence, keeping its answer just out of reach. The cave sits quiet now. The excavation units have been backfilled to protect what remains. The entrance stays sealed by that ancient fall of rock, and the tools themselves rest in climate-controlled storage, waiting. Waiting for sharper dating methods, for more sensitive ways of reading old DNA, for some future technique that might finally decide whether they were shaped by hands or only by time. And perhaps that is the honest place to end, because science has not resolved this, and pretending otherwise would be the real mistake. What Chiquihuite offers is not a tidy answer, but a harder, humbler one. Sometimes an entire people can pass through this world and leave almost nothing behind. No bones, no names, no descendants, only a scatter of stone in the dark. And the most difficult thing to accept may not be the tools buried in that mountain, but how much of our own story we still cannot read.